My parents walked into my Uncle Harold's will reading like they had already won. My mother wore pearls and a black dress, my father followed her in silence, and their attorney carried a briefcase like he was there to collect what belonged to them. What they didn't know was that Harold had left behind one document from the night they threw me out, and once it came out, my mother stopped looking like a grieving sister-in-law and started looking like someone who had been caught. My name is Diana Myers. I'm 28 now, but the part of my life that matters here started when I was 13, sitting on the front porch of our house in southeast Portland with my clothes stuffed into 2 black garbage bags. I can still picture the porch boards under my sneakers and the way the evening got colder after the sun went down. The porch light stayed off the whole time. Inside, my mother moved around like nothing unusual had happened, and my father stayed somewhere in the hallway, close enough to know I was out there, but not close enough to help. For a long time, I told myself maybe I was remembering it worse than it was. That is one of the things kids do when the truth is too ugly. They soften it so they can survive it. Before that night, I already knew I was the extra child, even if nobody said those exact words. My older sister Tiffany was the one my mother lit up for. Tiffany had my mom's blonde hair, her blue eyes, her laugh, and apparently every future worth investing in. When Tiffany turned 15, my mother rented a karaoke machine, ordered a 3-tier cake from a bakery, and invited half the neighborhood. When I turned 13 a few months later, we sat at the kitchen table with a marked-down grocery store cake that didn't even have my name on it. It just said, "Happy birthday," like it had been waiting for anybody. I remember staring at that cake longer than I should have. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself cake was cake, and maybe I was being dramatic, because that was another habit I had learned early. If something hurt me, I tried to shrink it before anyone else had the chance to call me ungrateful. The real fight started with a scholarship. In the spring of 2010, I applied for the Oregon STEM Summer Academy at Oregon State University without telling anyone. It was 6 weeks, fully covered, tuition, room, board, supplies, everything. I mailed the application from the public library because asking my mother for help would have turned it into a problem before it even had a chance to become good news. When the acceptance letter came, I read it in my room with the door locked. Out of more than 2,000 applicants, 50 students had been chosen, and somehow I was one of them. For a few hours, I walked around feeling strange in my own body, like maybe I was allowed to be excited about something that belonged only to me. Then Tiffany came home talking about a performing arts camp in California. 3 weeks, no scholarship, almost $4,000, and suddenly my thing became inconvenient. At dinner that night, my mother announced the decision like she had already finished arguing with me in her head. She said, "Diana, you'll decline the science program. We can't do both, and Tiffany's camp will help her college applications." She didn't look guilty. She didn't ask how much the scholarship covered. She just sliced through it like my opportunity was a coupon she had decided not to use. My father kept eating. Tiffany looked down at her plate. Not embarrassed enough to speak up, but not innocent enough to look confused. I said no before I knew I was going to say it. The word came out small, but it was still a no, and it changed the temperature of the room. My mother looked at me like I had just done something disgusting. She said, very quietly, "If you can't sacrifice for this family, then maybe you don't belong in this family." At 13, I thought that was just something angry parents said. 3 days later, I came home from the library and found the garbage bags on the porch. My mother stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and told me Uncle Harold was coming to get me. She said it like she had arranged a ride for an unwanted piece of furniture. "From now on, you're his problem," she told me. And I remember looking past her at my father because some part of me still thought he would correct that. He didn't. He just stood in the hallway with his eyes lowered, like silence was not a choice he was making. I sat there for 4 hours. That sounds dramatic, but it is just what happened. 6 p.m. became 7, then 8, then 9, and the whole time I kept listening for the front door to open. I kept thinking my mother would come out and say she had gone too far, or my father would at least bring me a jacket, or Tiffany would come down and sit beside me. None of them did. At one point, I looked up and saw Tiffany behind her bedroom curtain. Our eyes met for maybe 1 second before she stepped back into the dark. That was the first time I understood that someone could know exactly what was happening to you and still choose comfort over you. Uncle Harold lived in Seattle, almost 3 hours away, and he drove through the night to get me. When his gray Honda pulled into the driveway, I was sitting on top of one garbage bag with my knees pulled up, trying not to cry, because crying felt like losing in front of a house that had already rejected me. Harold got out of the car and didn't ask me what I had done. That was the first thing I noticed. He didn't look at me like a problem to be solved. He walked straight up the steps, pulled me into his arms, and held me so tightly I could barely breathe. Then he said, "You have a home now." I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I had spent so long trying to earn a place at a table that never had a chair for me, and here was someone giving me a whole home without making me beg for it. What I didn't know that night was that my mother and father had signed papers before Harold drove away. I didn't see the documents. Nobody explained anything to me. I was 13, exhausted, ashamed, and sitting in the passenger seat of Harold's car with my trash bags in the back. I remember the freeway lights sliding over the windshield and Harold keeping one hand on the wheel and one hand resting near the gear shift, like he didn't want to crowd me, but wanted me to know he was there. I kept waiting for him to ask questions. He didn't. He only said, "You can sleep if you want." I couldn't sleep. I stared out the window and wondered what kind of daughter gets packed up like that. Harold's house in Ballard wasn't fancy, but to me it felt impossible. There was a bed that was mine, a desk that was mine, and a dresser that didn't have to be shared or cleared out if someone else needed the space. The first morning, he made scrambled eggs and toast and asked if I wanted orange juice. I said I didn't want to be trouble. He stopped with the carton in his hand and said, "Diana, breakfast is not trouble." It was such a small thing, but I almost cried over it. In my mother's house, needing anything had always felt like taking something from Tiffany. At Harold's, needing something did not make me selfish. I still went to the STEM Academy that summer. Harold drove me there himself. He bought me notebooks, a new backpack, and one of those cheap plastic laundry baskets because he said dorm rooms always needed one. I remember standing outside the residence hall with students carrying suitcases and parents hugging them goodbye, and I suddenly felt embarrassed by how badly I wanted him to be proud of me. He was. He made it obvious. He told every staff member who would listen that I had earned my place there. Not that I was lucky, not that someone had helped me, not that I had been given charity. Earned. That word did more for me than he probably knew. Over the next few years, I became almost painfully focused. I studied like I was building a wall between myself and the porch. Ballard High became the place where I could be measured by grades and effort instead of how much my mother liked my face. I graduated valedictorian, ran the math club, and got into the University of Washington with a partial scholarship. Harold came to every ceremony, every award night, every awkward school event where I pretended I didn't care if anyone showed up. He always showed up. Sometimes I would spot him in the back of a room before he saw me, sitting there in his work jacket, looking proud before I had even done anything. My biological family reached out 3 times in 15 years, and none of those times were really about me. The first time, my mother called Harold to ask for $5,000 because my father had lost his job. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I liked Seattle, or if I had made friends, or if I was still hurt. Harold told me after he hung up, and he looked angrier than I had ever seen him. The second time was Tiffany's wedding invitation, mailed to Harold's address with no note inside. The third time was an email from my mother after she saw a business article mentioning Myers Property Holdings. That was the first time she acted curious about my life, and it was also the first time my life looked useful to her. By the time Harold offered me a full-time position at Myers Property Holdings, I had already learned the company from the bottom up. I started with boring files, lease summaries, tenant spreadsheets, insurance renewals, all the work nobody claps for, but everybody needs done correctly. Harold never let me skip the dull parts just because he loved me. He said if I ever wanted authority in the business, I had to understand the parts people only notice when they go wrong. That made sense to me. I had been noticing things that went wrong since I was a kid. I got my finance degree, then my CPA certification, and eventually became controller. A year after that, Harold made me CFO. I was 26, and I could feel people waiting to see if I was just the rescued niece with a title. I worked harder because of that, maybe too hard. But I knew what people assumed when a young woman with the owner's last name got an executive job. Harold did not protect me from skepticism. He gave me room to prove myself, and then he backed me when I did. Under my watch, the portfolio grew, occupancy stayed high, and the staff stopped treating me like Harold's soft spot and started treating me like the person who could answer the hard questions in a meeting. Then, in the summer of 2024, Harold got sick. Congestive heart failure, advanced enough that the doctors stopped trying to make the timeline sound gentle. 12 to 18 months, they said. He lasted 8. I still hate how small that number feels. 8 months to watch the person who gave me a life start measuring his days by medication times, doctor visits, and how far he could walk without needing to sit down. He stayed clear-headed, though. Even near the end, he was still asking about tenant renewals and capital improvements and whether the building on Capitol Hill needed a new roof before winter. During those months, Harold met several times with Margaret Morrison, his estate attorney. I knew he was updating things, but I did not push for details. Part of me didn't want to talk about what would happen after he was gone, because talking about it made it feel like I was agreeing to it. When I asked once, he only said, "Everything is handled. You focus on the company." That sounded like Harold, practical and maddeningly calm. I thought he meant the ordinary things, the estate transfer, the business succession, the donations he cared about. I had no idea he was preparing for my parents like they were a storm system he could see coming years before it hit. Harold died on February 28, 2025, at Swedish Medical Center with my hand wrapped around his. I wish I could say I said something meaningful in that room, but I mostly kept telling him I was there. Afterward, everything moved in that strange mechanical way grief has. Forms had to be signed, people had to be called, the memorial had to be arranged. I slept in pieces and answered emails I barely remembered answering. 3 days after the memorial, my phone rang from a Portland number I didn't recognize, and the second I heard my mother say my name, my whole body went cold before my brain caught up. "Diana," she said, in that careful voice she used when she wanted something, but wanted to sound wounded first. I said, "Sandra," not Mom. I had not called her that in years, and I heard the pause on the other end. She told me she had heard about Harold and was sorry for my loss. Then she said she had been thinking she should come up for the memorial and pay her respects. I told her the memorial had already happened. She recovered fast. She said there was still the will reading, and family had a right to attend important things like that, especially when a brother's estate was involved. There it was. Not grief, not regret, not even curiosity about how I was holding up after losing the man who raised me. She wanted the room where the money would be discussed. I asked how she knew about the will reading, and she said she had an attorney, Victor Harrington, who had made some calls. The name bothered me, though I couldn't place why at first. After we hung up, I called Margaret. By the next morning, she confirmed it. Sandra and Richard had hired Harrington to challenge Harold's will, claiming undue influence. According to them, I had isolated Harold while he was sick and manipulated him into leaving me everything. I remember sitting in my office staring at the framed photo on my desk, the one of Harold at my college graduation with his arm around my shoulders. My parents had ignored me for 15 years, but now they were describing me like a predator. They were saying I had taken advantage of a lonely, sick man when they had not even come to see him. They were demanding half the estate, not because they had loved Harold, not because they had helped build anything, but because Richard was his brother, and Sandra thought the word family could be pulled out like a key whenever money was behind the door. When I met Margaret on the 47th floor of the Columbia Center, rain was streaking down the windows behind her. She laid the challenge paperwork on the desk and told me their case was weak. But weak did not mean harmless. If they dragged the estate into litigation, the properties could be tied up for months, maybe longer. Legal fees could eat through hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the business could take damage just from uncertainty. That was the plan. They did not need to win cleanly. They just needed to make the fight expensive enough that I would pay them to leave. Margaret asked if I had any documentation from the night I went to live with Harold. I almost laughed because I was 13 when it happened. I did not keep evidence. I kept shame, mostly. But Margaret did not look surprised. She said Harold had kept records, and 20 minutes later her assistant brought in an old folder from the archives. Margaret opened it, read for a moment, then went very still. She slid a yellow document across the desk to me. The header said, "Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and transfer of guardianship," dated July 15th, 2010. My hands started shaking before I finished the first paragraph. Richard James Myers and Sandra Ellen Myers had voluntarily relinquished all parental rights and responsibilities for their minor daughter, Diana Marie Myers, and transferred full legal guardianship to Harold Raymond Myers. Their signatures were at the bottom: my mother's, my father's, Harold's, a notary's. That night on the porch had not just been an emotional rejection. It had been paperwork. While I sat outside thinking maybe someone would change their mind, they had already made sure they did not have to. Margaret let me sit with the document for a minute before she explained what it meant. She did not rush me, and I appreciated that, because my brain was doing this strange thing where it understood every word but refused to accept the whole sentence. My parents had not just kicked me out in anger. They had legally handed me away and then spent 15 years pretending the family bond still existed whenever it was useful. Margaret said it plainly. "Diana, they severed their legal relationship to you. Harold did not steal you from them. They signed you over." I asked what it did to their claim, and Margaret's answer was careful but clear. Richard was Harold's brother, yes, but the argument they were trying to build depended on family connection, natural inheritance, and this idea that I had somehow cut Harold off from his real family. The document made that story much harder to sell. It showed that Harold had stepped in after they gave me up, not because I manipulated him, not because I isolated him, but because they had decided I was no longer their responsibility. Margaret also told me something else. Harold had anticipated a challenge. He had left instructions that if Richard or Sandra tried to contest the will, certain documents were to be read into the record. That was when Margaret gave me two options. The first was the clean business option. She could contact Harrington, show him enough to make him nervous, and offer a settlement in exchange for a full waiver. $500,000, maybe more, but far less than a long court fight might cost. She said it would be faster, quieter, and practical. The second option was to proceed with the will reading and let my parents attend because they had demanded to be there. If they wanted the status of family in public, then the record would show exactly what kind of family they had chosen to be. I went home that night with copies of the documents in my bag. I put them on the kitchen table and just stared at them for a while. The house was quiet in that heavy way it had been since Harold died. His coffee mug was still in the cabinet. His reading glasses were still on the side table in the living room. There were photos of us on the mantle. My high school graduation, my college graduation, the day I got my CPA license, the first company holiday dinner where he introduced me as his CFO and not his niece. I looked at those pictures and realized he had been correcting the record for years in all the ways that mattered, even before the law had to. I called Margaret the next morning and told her no settlement. My voice shook a little when I said it, which annoyed me, but I said it anyway. I was tired of money being used as a shortcut around the truth. Sandra and Richard had already filed a challenge, accusing me of manipulating a dying man, and I knew if I quietly paid them, they would walk away, telling anyone who listened that I had paid because I was scared. I said, "Let them come, but we are not hiding what they did." Margaret was quiet for a second, then said, "Harold wanted you to have that choice." The days before the will reading felt unreal. My best friend Elena helped me organize everything, partly because she was good with records, and partly because she knew I would forget to eat if someone did not keep checking on me. We pulled company performance reports, old emails from Harold, donation records, adoption paperwork, and the guardianship document. Elena found 47 emails over the years where Harold had written about Richard, the unpaid $80,000 loan from 2002, and why he no longer trusted his brother. Those emails mattered because they proved something Sandra was trying to erase. Harold's break with Richard did not begin with me. I was not the wedge. I was the child who arrived after the crack was already there. On Thursday evening, I met with Dr. Hayes because I could feel the old 13-year-old part of me getting loud again. Not in words exactly, more like a pressure in my chest. What if they humiliated me? What if I froze? What if my mother looked at me in that old way and I suddenly felt small again? Dr. Hayes did not tell me I was stronger than them or that I would win. She asked me what I needed to remember when I walked into the room. I said that I did not create this. She nodded and said, "Then don't carry it like you did." The will reading was scheduled for Friday, March 14th, 2025 at 2 p.m. in Morrison & Associates conference room. I arrived early in a navy suit with my hair pinned back, not because I wanted to look cold, but because I needed fewer things to think about. The room had a long table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view of Elliott Bay under a gray sky. Margaret was already there with 2 associates. Thomas Graham, Harold's longtime auditor, sat near the window. Representatives from Seattle Children's Hospital, Habitat for Humanity Northwest, and the Olympic National Park Foundation were there too, along with several senior staff members from the company. Harold had wanted witnesses. I understood that as soon as I saw the room. At 2:03 p.m., the elevator doors opened. Sandra stepped out first, dressed like a widow in a play where she had given herself the lead role. Richard came behind her in a gray suit that looked uncomfortable on him, and Tiffany followed in a pale pink dress that felt wrong for the room. Victor Harrington walked last, polished and expensive, carrying himself like he had already calculated my fear. Sandra smiled when she saw me seated at the main table. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind she used before saying something meant to sound polite and leave a bruise. She asked if we could speak privately because family matters should be handled by family. I told her the proceedings would begin in 2 minutes. Margaret directed them to the chairs along the wall, explaining that the main table was reserved for beneficiaries and estate representatives. Sandra's face tightened. That was the first small correction of the day. She had come expecting the center of the room, and before anyone even read a page, she had already been placed at the edge. Sandra did not take the wall seat quietly. She moved through the room slowly, pausing near the charity representatives, like she needed strangers to understand her importance before the legal part began. She introduced herself as Harold's sister-in-law and said they had been close before certain people created distance in the family. She did not look at me when she said it, which somehow made it more obvious. Dr. Patricia Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital gave her a polite nod and nothing else. But Sandra kept going, because Sandra had never known how to leave silence alone. She said Harold had been generous and trusting, maybe too trusting, and Tiffany added from her chair that Uncle Harold used to visit them when they were kids, so she did not understand why I was at the table and they were on the wall. I kept my eyes on the folder in front of me. I could feel Victor Harrington watching for any reaction he could turn into a note. My mother wanted me angry. She wanted me emotional. She wanted the room to see me as unstable before Margaret read even one clause. So I sat there and gave her nothing, which was harder than it looked. Then Sandra said the line I still remember most clearly. She said, "A child who gets rejected by her parents usually gives them a reason." She said it in front of everyone, in a conference room full of people who had known Harold as a donor, employer, client, and friend. For a second, nobody moved. Thomas Graham looked up so sharply I heard his chair creak. Tiffany stared at her lap. Richard did what Richard always did and looked anywhere except at the damage being done. I felt the old shame rise up first, because that line had lived inside me for years in different words. Then something colder moved in behind it. She had just said the quiet part out loud. Margaret began the reading at 2:10 p.m. Her voice was steady, formal, and almost too calm for the amount of tension in the room. She confirmed Harold's identity, the date of the will, and his mental capacity, including a psychiatric evaluation completed 8 days before he signed it. I saw Victor lean toward Sandra and whisper something, and her expression changed a little. They had come prepared to argue Harold was sick, confused, or controlled. The will had already blocked that door before they reached the money. Then Margaret read the estate inventory. 12 commercial properties, investment accounts, cash reserves, personal effects. The total was close to $24 million, and I heard Tiffany whisper the number under her breath, like she had not meant to say it out loud. Sandra's posture changed. It was small, but I saw it. Her grief face tightened into something more alert, more hungry. She was not listening like a woman mourning Harold. She was listening like someone waiting for her name to be called. Margaret turned to the section about Richard, and for one quick second my mother smiled. She really thought this was where the will would acknowledge them. Instead, Margaret read that Harold made no provision for his brother, Richard James Myers, and that he wanted the reasons read aloud and entered into the record. The smile dropped from Sandra's face so fast it almost looked painful. Margaret read about the $80,000 loan Richard had taken in 2002 and never repaid. Richard went pale, and I saw his hand move toward his tie like it had suddenly become too tight. Then Margaret read the second reason. On July 15, 2010, Richard and Sandra Myers had voluntarily executed a legal document relinquishing all parental rights to Diana Marie Myers and transferring full guardianship to Harold Raymond Myers. Sandra stood up before Margaret finished the sentence. Her chair scraped backward, loud and ugly. "What does that have to do with anything?" she snapped. Margaret did not raise her voice. She simply said the certified copy was on file with King County Family Court, then placed the document on the table where everyone could see it. Sandra looked at that paper like it had crawled out of the past and sat down in front of her. Margaret continued reading Harold's explanation. By terminating their parental relationship with me, Richard and Sandra had severed the family claim they were now trying to use. I was Harold's legal heir. Richard was not my legal father. The room went very quiet, but not empty quiet. It was full of people understanding the same thing at the same time. My parents had walked in calling themselves family, and the document on the table said they had chosen not to be. Richard stood next, slower than Sandra, and said he was Harold's blood brother. Victor grabbed his arm and pulled him back down, but his own face had changed. The polish was still there, but it had gone thin. Margaret looked at him once, then kept reading, as if none of them had interrupted. Sandra pointed at me and said I had manipulated Harold, poisoned him, turned him against them. Her voice got sharper with every word, like volume could push the document back into the folder. I finally looked at her and said, "You put my things in trash bags and left me outside in the dark. Then you signed me away. I was 13. I did not say it loudly. I did not need to. The sentence sat there harder because it was plain. Sandra opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, she could not turn the room fast enough. Margaret waited a few seconds, then said there was still Clause 7 to read. I had known what was coming because Margaret had warned me, but knowing did not make it easier. My hands were folded in my lap under the table, and I pressed my fingers together so nobody would see them shaking. Margaret read Clause 7, the designation of sole beneficiary. Harold left the entirety of his estate, including all real property, investment accounts, liquid assets, and personal effects, to his legally adopted daughter, Diana Marie Myers. The word adopted hit the room harder than the money. Sandra's face went white. Richard asked, almost hoarsely, "Since when?" Margaret answered that Harold had formally adopted me on September 12th, 2012, when I was 15, and because Sandra and Richard had already relinquished their parental rights, no further consent was required. Tiffany looked at me then, really looked at me, and said, "So you're not even related to us anymore?" It was such a strange question after everything that had just been read. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Did you know?" Not, "I'm sorry." Just that. I told her, "Not legally, not since Mom and Dad signed me away." She flinched at the words Mom and Dad, and I almost regretted using them, but only for a second. They were the ones who had emptied those words out. Margaret continued with Harold's own language. He wrote that I was his daughter in every way that mattered, legally, practically, and emotionally. He wrote that I had worked beside him, earned his trust, and had the integrity to continue what he built. I tried to keep my face still, but my eyes blurred before I could stop it. I had heard Harold call me his daughter in private, in emails, in little ordinary ways. Hearing it read into a legal record, with my mother sitting 10 feet away, was different. It corrected something I had stopped admitting was still crooked inside me. Then Margaret opened a smaller, sealed envelope. Harold had left a letter for me, with instructions that part of it could be read aloud if I agreed. I nodded because I could not trust my voice. Margaret read that if the letter was being heard in that room, then things had happened exactly as Harold expected. My biological family had shown up for money they had not earned from a man they had not cared for. Sandra made a small sound, but Margaret kept going. Harold wrote that I had come to him wounded, but I had not stayed that way. He wrote that he had not saved me, only given me a place to save myself. That was when Sandra changed tactics. The anger drained out of her face and was replaced with something softer, something practiced. She stood again and called me sweetheart. She said she knew things had been hard when I was young, and she had made mistakes, but we were still blood. Then she said maybe we could talk about dividing the estate fairly. It was almost impressive how quickly motherhood turned into math. I wiped my face, looked at her, and said, "You gave up the right to call me sweetheart 15 years ago." Sandra turned to Victor and demanded he tell everyone they had grounds to fight. Victor did not answer right away. Margaret turned her iPad around and showed an email from Harold to Victor dated March 3rd, 2022. In it, Harold terminated Victor's services because Victor had advised him to include Richard in his estate plan, despite Richard's financial exploitation and the way Richard and Sandra had treated me. The room shifted again. This was not just my parents overreaching anymore. Their attorney had walked in with a conflict he had not disclosed, and now everyone knew it. Victor stood up with his briefcase in one hand and all his confidence leaking out of him. He said he needed to review the documents privately. Sandra stared at him like he had betrayed her personally, which was almost funny in a way I did not have the energy to enjoy. She called his name twice as he walked out, but he did not turn back. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time since she entered that room, my mother had no one to perform through. She sat down slowly, and the pearls at her throat looked less like dignity and more like costume jewelry under office lights. Margaret continued the reading after Victor left, and the room had a different feeling after that. Not lighter exactly, because nothing about it felt light, but the performance was over. Sandra sat with both hands clenched around her purse. Richard stared at the carpet, and Tiffany kept wiping under her eyes with one finger, like she did not want anyone to see she was crying. Margaret moved on to Harold's charitable gifts. $500,000 to Seattle Children's Hospital for a scholarship fund, $300,000 to Habitat for Humanity Northwest, and $200,000 to the Olympic National Park Foundation. Hearing those gifts read after watching my parents fight for money made the contrast almost embarrassing. Harold had planned for children, housing, and land preservation. My parents had planned for a payout. When Margaret asked if I wanted to say anything, I almost said no. I had not prepared a speech, and I was tired in a way that made even standing up feel like too much. But then I looked around the room and saw people who had known Harold in real life, not as an estate, not as a number, not as an opportunity. I told them I intended to continue what he built. I said the properties would stay under the same standards, the charitable commitments would continue, and I would be creating the Myers STEM Scholarship for kids from difficult family situations who needed someone to believe in them before the world had decided they were worth believing in. My voice shook on that last part, but I kept going. I did look at Sandra once while I was speaking. I did not do it to punish her. I think I needed to see for myself that she was not bigger than the room anymore. I said I held no grudge, but peace did not mean pretending the past had not happened. I said Harold had taught me that family was not the people who used the word when it helped them. Family was the people who showed up when showing up cost something. Thomas Graham started clapping first, which surprised me, and then others joined. Sandra did not clap. She sat there with her mouth tight and her eyes fixed on the table, and for once I did not care what she thought. The reading ended at 3:47 p.m. Margaret said the estate transfer would begin the following week, and people started standing, gathering folders, shaking hands, speaking in low voices. Sandra got up slowly, like she had aged in the last 2 hours. Richard left first without looking at me. Tiffany followed, but she turned at the doorway for half a second, and the look on her face was not anger. It was something messier, something I could not name yet. Sandra stayed behind a little longer. She opened her mouth like she might say sorry, but nothing came out. Then she turned and walked away, still holding the same purse she had clutched through the whole collapse. The fallout did not end in that room. A week later, Margaret filed a complaint with the Washington State Bar Association over Victor Harrington's conflict of interest. I did not ask her to do it. She said she had an obligation, and honestly, after watching him try to use Harold's private history against the estate, I was not going to argue. A few months later, he was suspended for 6 months, fined $15,000, and required to complete ethics training. I heard through Margaret that several clients left his firm after that. I did not feel victorious about it. He had made his choices in a suit with a very expensive briefcase, and the consequences simply found him. Sandra sent me an email 3 weeks after the will reading. The subject line said, "Please read." I did read it, because part of me still wanted to know what kind of apology she would offer when there was nothing left to gain. It was not really an apology. She said she had made mistakes, but then blamed stress and money problems. She said she was not asking for money, then wrote that we should sit down and work through everything as a family. She signed it, Mom. I read that word 3 times and felt nothing warm from it. I replied with 4 sentences. I told her I had forgiven her for myself, not for her, but I did not want a relationship, and she should not contact me again. Tiffany's letter came 2 months later, handwritten and wrinkled at the edges like she had carried it around before mailing it. I expected more excuses, but that was not what she wrote. She told me she remembered the night I sat on the porch. She admitted she had watched me from the window for 4 hours and never came down. She said she could have brought me water or sat beside me, or at least told me she was sorry, but she had stayed in her room because it was easier to be the favored daughter than the brave sister. I read that letter 4 times. It was the first honest thing anyone from that house had ever given me. I did not forgive Tiffany all at once. I still have not in the clean way people like to imagine. But I wrote back 4 months later and told her I was open to cautious contact, with conditions. No messages through Sandra or Richard, no talk about money or Harold's estate, no pressure for closeness I was not ready to give. We started with 1 15-minute video call a month. The first call was awkward and stiff, and I almost canceled it 3 times before it began. But she showed up without asking for anything. That mattered. Not enough to erase the window, but enough to start somewhere small. 1 year after the will reading, I stood outside the first building Harold ever bought, a modest commercial property on Capitol Hill that we had renovated the previous fall. A bronze plaque had been mounted beside the entrance. It read, "The Harold R. Myers Building, in memory of a man who chose love over blood." I touched his name with my fingertips and thought about that porch in Portland, the garbage bags, the dark window, the paper my parents signed, and the room where the truth finally had witnesses. The company had grown. The scholarship had awarded its first grants. 5 students were going to summer STEM programs because Harold once believed in a girl whose own parents had treated her like a burden. I do not think stories like mine end with one clean feeling. I still have days when something small brings back the old question of why I was so easy for them to give up. But the difference now is that I do not answer that question by blaming myself. Sandra and Richard made a choice, then tried years later to profit from a relationship they had destroyed, on paper and in real life. Harold made a different choice, and eventually, I made mine too. I chose the people who showed up. I chose boundaries without apology. I chose to stop auditioning for a family that had already closed the door and signed the form. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this. Have you ever had someone use the word family only when they wanted something from you? Do you think Diana was right to cut Sandra off completely? And would you have given Tiffany a cautious second chance after that letter?